Um, Hi. I have been doing traditional wooden boats since about '81. There used to be a boat building school up the road here, not far, not even a mile, and it's now in Rockland, Maine. And I've been lucky that basically all I've ever done is these either very small or very big traditional boats. I don't know that too many people could be a boat builder and say that they've cut one piece of teak in 45 years, but that's been my experience. To me, a piece of Douglas fir is an exotic piece of wood. The Arnold Expedition, let me get this done because I'll forget. There is a group called the Arnold Expedition Historical Society, and it's a group of about 8 old men. I'm the youngest, I think, and they were set up in 1975 or even a little earlier to celebrate for the bicentennial, and in which they built a bunch of bateaux and had a few events, and we're doing the same thing again. And it's we meaning the state of Maine and you people, we own the building where the bateaux were originally built. It is a 1765 house, and it's up on the Kennebec, up in the north end of Pittston. This is the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution. You know, as we all know, Lexington and Concord in April of '75. And from that point on, all these hooligans and ne'er-do-wells showed up out of the woods and sat around the city of Boston taking pot shots at them. But nothing, well, I take it back. I can't say nothing ever happened. There was that minor little scuffle called Bunker Hill. But basically they sat there almost a year just keeping the British tied up in Boston. And they went from that and took a group and decided to attack Quebec. I got thrown off by that thing saying, that's fantastic, when I said, holy Christ. Let me start again, sort of. I want to correct 3 mistakes. There's 3 things that you'll hear a lot about the Arnold expedition. One is that the bateaux were lousy. Don't bother to fact check me. You won't be able to find out that what I'm telling you is true. But one was that the bateaux were lousy, that they shouldn't even have built bateaux, they should have built canoes. The other is I love to call about the Woolwich quitters. And that's because I live in Woolwich, and about a dozen men from Woolwich quit at some point on the expedition. In fact, the last 300 men came back, and so I call them the quitters. And the third thing I want to correct is about women on the expedition. And hopefully I'll remember to correct it as I go, if I can. That thing will let me get back on course here. You had the people surrounding Boston. Basically, the British were just in a couple of major cities, and they did not dare go outside the cities. I mean, they would on occasion when they learned there was gunpowder or somebody who they wanted to arrest, which is what Lexington and Concord was. But basically, the British were stuck inside, you know, Boston, Newport, New York, what have you, and surrounded by a bunch of Yankees, at least at the beginning. We had an interesting revolution which really explains a lot about who we are. Washington hated the Yankees. He said the Yankees, you could not tell them what to do. You know, you could suggest something, but if you tried to tell them something, they'd just go home. The officers had fragile egos, and if somebody got appointed above them, they quit. I've read an article, and it's called The Resignation Revolution, because they were constantly, oh, you appointed him, I should have been appointed, I quit, I'm out of here. And then the different colonies didn't get along with each other, which I guess I was sort of thinking, I guess it's probably because they didn't have television, so they had to have a hobby, and that would be fighting with your neighbors. You know? But the Congress, the Continental Congress, decided to attack Canada and see if they would join the revolution, see if they would be the 14th colony. It was not a land grab. You know, like I say, the different colonies couldn't even agree with each other what their borders were. There was no way they were going to grab this chunk of land and take it over. What it was is the St. Lawrence flows through the lower part of Canada, and at some point you can get off the St. Lawrence and come onto Lake Champlain, 16-mile portage, and you're on the Hudson, and you can come down and cut the rest of the colonies off from New England and New York. And this was the traditional route of battle. The French, the Indians, and the British had been using this for 100+ years. In fact, by the War of 1812, it was still the route of battle to try to cut the American colonies apart. And so we were sending 2,000 soldiers up to Quebec. I'll probably go back and forth, you know, basically it's the same thing. We'll go up to Quebec to stop the British there, and also to see if the French Canadians, who had only been British citizens for around 15 years, to see if they would join the revolution. We sent 2,000 men up there. At this time, Benedict Arnold, and I'll have to point out, he was one of our greatest military leaders for the first years. Benedict Arnold had written a letter to the Continental Congress and said, we ought to attack Quebec, for basically what I've just said. We ought to, cut it off so they can't come attack us. It would also be cutting off a food and money source of wheat and fur and what have you. They said we ought to attack Quebec. He gave a big long list. We need this many shovels, this many saws, this many tents, what have you. He had it well planned out, or he had it planned out, I can't say it as well. And he sent it to the Continental Congress down in Philadelphia. And he also said, if you can't find anybody to lead it, I'll do it. But you should find somebody with more experience than I to do it. This letter was sent to Congress. Congress decided to do it, but didn't pick Arnold. They picked a guy named Schuyler. I hope I said that right. This is around the same time that Washington has showed up outside of Boston. He's getting to know all these wonderful Yankee cooperative soldiers who are so helpful. And he goes and somebody, and we don't know where this idea came from, somebody suggested a second attack on Quebec. You had 2,000 soldiers. It didn't end up being that many, but you had 2,000 soldiers were supposed to go up Lake Champlain and onto the St. Lawrence, and 1,000 soldiers were supposed to go up the Kennebec. We go, I'll give you another map. It's probably too hard to see, but this is up Lake Champlain, Lake George, Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River, and down to Montreal, and between tidal water in the Hudson and tidal water on the St. Lawrence, you don't raise much more than 300 feet over that length of time. This is the other route that was suggested. Go up to Newburyport, up to the Kennebec, sail up to Augusta, at which point you get into Bateaux, and go up the Kennebec, 13 miles over a height of land, back into the river to another height of land, and down the Chaudière to just a few miles above river from Quebec. This was 300 some feet, was all they needed to do to get, from the Hudson to the St. Lawrence. The height of land here was around 1,000 feet in the first 3 miles to get from the Kennebec over into the Dead River, which really is still the Kennebec. Whoops, wrong way. Still the wrong way. How can it be the wrong way both sides? Okay. You'll hear people say that we didn't know anything about the route up the Kennebec. People will write this, that we don't know anything about the route up the Kennebec. People will write that only one white man has ever been on that route. Well, this is a map drawn 10 years before the Revolution, showing you how to get from the ocean up to the St. Lawrence, and it's not bad. It's a pretty good map. Number of people that done it. A famous person, which had a lot of effect on Arnold, was a Captain Montresor, who was a British Army officer, and he went by snowshoe from Quebec to Topsom one year, and then the next year he went by canoe, and he went up the Chaudière, over to Moosehead, down to the Sebasticook, to Waterville, Winslow, where he arrived at Fort Halifax, and then he returned by going up the Kennebec and over the height of land. And that actually, they knew, this wasn't, again, like I was saying, nobody knew this route. They knew that you came from Quebec to here by Moosehead Lake, you returned by the Kennebec. So there must have been something about the different kinds of waterfalls and what have you had to carry. And another thing is, there was a American officer who had fought in the French and Indian War and had been one of Rogers' Rangers, and he had suggested this route months before anybody else thought of it. He had suggested this route, and he told it to the Massachusetts Continental Congress. Well, that meant he skipped over people. He was supposed to have told people just above him. He wasn't supposed to go to the top, and this really pissed everybody off. And so nobody did anything with this, and then that man was severely wounded at Bunker Hill. Like I say, that house still exists. It was built in 1765. It still exists, it's ours, it belongs to the state. And it's currently, they're rebuilding it, but there's a barn, and in the barn, we're building Bateaux. And unfortunately, right now we're only open like Tuesdays, but there's a bunch of Bateaux and a birch bark canoe and dugouts and what have you. If you should happen to see the doors open, come on in. This guy, Reuben Colburn, believed in the revolution, and he went down to Boston. He brought Indians down to Boston to see if see if Washington would take them. And the American Army didn't want Indians, so they didn't really do anything with these Indians. But this also gave gave Colburn time to meet with George Washington. And I have to point out, and again, don't fact check me because I have no proof, George Washington wasn't an idiot. Benedict Arnold wasn't an idiot. Reuben Colburn wasn't an idiot. Washington and Arnold didn't say, oh, let's send 1,100 soldiers 2 weeks from now to the Kennebec because this guy claims there will be 200 bateaux and food and everything else for them. Obviously, you know, the boat builder, it was more than just a flight of fancy. He knew he had a pretty good chance of having 200 bateaux and food and oars, all the 800 oars and paddles and poles. He knew he could probably do that. Now, there's no way in the world you could build 200 bateaux in 2 weeks. The 6 men took 2 days to build 1 bateau, okay? But again, like I say, I can't prove any of this, but this was a shipyard. They were launching big ships here, okay? The boat builder is criticized by the pipsqueak 22-year-old doctor, saying the boats were heavy because they were built with green pine. Well, you're not going to have cut up all your nice big pine trees into little 5/8 inch boards. You might need them for decking on a boat. You might need them for a whole bunch of things. You're not going to have cut that up. And so yes, they were a little heavy. They were green. Once you put a dry boat in the river, the bottom half of it's going to soak up to that same weight anyways. So it's not as if, it was an incredible, but this 22-year-old doctor who had his boys to carry the boat said it was heavy. What else? Some of them were in pretty bad shape. It's most likely that Colburn went up and down the river to anybody he could find and said, sell me your bateau, I'll build you another one over the winter, And so some of them were probably bad, some of them were probably just fine, To knock out however many they did build, again, this rush job, some of them were bad, some of them were just fine. There are 36 journals about the expedition. Some of the people complain bitterly. Some people don't have not one complaint. They're not complaining about their bateau, they're not complaining the weather, they're not. So again, that seems to me to point out that the bateaux mostly were in relatively good shape. There's a funny thing here is one of the bateaux, the guy named his bateau the Charming Betsy, because that was his wife. And I thought, well, that's interesting, And then I was reading about the French and Indian War, and you would send off 200 boats on Lake Champlain, and the guys would name their boats or ID them somehow. And then I realized, you have 200 boats. Your boat turns out to be great. That boat's crap. I want to make sure after I go to bed at night and I get up in the morning, I still have my boat, you know. And so they did, you know, mark their boats in various ways. So they knew they were getting, you know, keeping track of their boat. So Arnold came, this is about 8 miles below the waterfall, Augusta, at where Fort Western is. Some of Arnold's sailing vessels could not make it to Augusta. They might have been able to make it depending on the tide, but for that limited time they could not make it. But they transported some bateaux, they transported some food, they transported some whatever from here or partway up to Fort Western. Again, nobody but one person mentions this. They all make it sound like, yeah, they get in their bateau at Fort Western and headed up the river. Well, at that time period, there was a big island, no longer there, that's been blown up, where the waterfall is, and there was a nasty set of rapids. You're not going to launch 100 tons of cargo below the waterfall when it'd be just much easier to put it on a wagon and taking it that half mile above this nasty set of rapids. Some of the men, on the 2 days it took them to get to Fort Halifax, which is Winslow and Waterville, complained bitterly. Some of them didn't say a word about it, okay? Part of that is that I don't care if you've sailed a square rigger around the Horn, poling 2,000 pounds up rapids is a skill, and you're not going to learn it in an hour. And as a matter of fact, Washington, when this whole thing started, said he wanted bateau men. He wanted people who knew how to do it. I haven't yet found anybody who actually knew how to pole a bateau. But they're pulling the bateau up. Occasionally it would get away from them, go down, slam into rocks. The other thing is going up. You figure you're not going fast. How do you wear a bottom out? Well, you take a bunch of 20-year-old guys, all sort of macho, and they get up and they hit a shallow spot, and so they just drag it over the spot rather than going back down and going around. So by Fort Halifax, they already had some bateaux that were leaking. Some of the journals make it sound like they never rowed, they never really did anything inside the boat until they got to the height of land, up by where Bingham, Moscow, Solon is, that the whole time they were outside the boat pulling it up the rapids. There's another story in one of the journals of these guys taking 8 times trying to get up these rapids and failing. And then they hire these 2 Indians who are watching them, and 2 Indians just up the rapids they go, you know. It is a skill, and the problem with a bateau is you have to compromise. It has to be light enough to carry a mile and 2 miles around a set of falls. Back then, 150 pounds was an acceptable weight to carry. So if these bateaux weighed 400, that meant that the 4 guys would be carrying 100, not 150. But carrying 100 pounds up a very steep hill is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. As they go up the Kennebec, and there's only 4 times they have to portage. After they go up the Kennebec, they've lost a lot of bateaux, they've destroyed a lot of bateaux, They've lost a lot of food. Arnold was optimistic, and it didn't always work out. The barrels of salt beef were bad, or the beef was bad. It had been put up in the wrong time of the year, and so they just end up throwing away all this barrels of beef. Their barrels of peas and bread were not watertight, which, there's certain things you don't need to worry about making a watertight barrel. The peas and the bread were not watertight, and so those were ruined. They had salted fish, which they just laid in the bottom of the bateau. And so since they were constantly taking water in, all the salt fish went bad. So by the time they got to the height of land, or the Great Carry, they were down to salt pork and bread, or flour, and not even as much as a soldier should have been given every day. Whoops. I tell you, this guy telling me that's fantastic is just throwing me off so much. 8 years ago, we built a bateau here at Maine's First Ship. That white shed is, the Virginia still hasn't been launched. We used the design that was used in the 1975 recreation. I didn't realize there was anything wrong with it. It was a horrible design. And in fact, the guy in 1975 afterwards said, "That's a horrible boat, I won't build you one of those." Okay. But we built one here at Maine's First Ship. Oops. And here we are launching it at the Reuben Colburn's house site. Just to remind you, if it's a color photograph, it's not a historical one, it's model. But here we are, and it's like 80 degrees, end of September, and we're starting where they started. And you see all the freeboard, meaning how much space there is between the lowest point and the rail. And we only have 3 people on the boat. We don't have any supplies. We don't have a 4th person. Now, I will be honest and say you'll notice that Allison is bailing. So there may be some benefit to when it gets watertight, which it never did. And this is the design we're building now. And this actually is a little too big. But this is much more what they would have built in 1775. Again, using all these little bits of information, I shortened the next one 2 feet. That one's 22 feet. The one we built now is 20. I might be willing to shorten it more. And it's one of these funny little pieces of information. As you remember that British officer who snowshoed here and then canoed and went back by canoe? He had Mohawk Indians working for him, and the Mohawks were not local. And this British officer and his Mohawks had trouble finding the portage routes. And this is a 10,000-year-old trail. And he says it's because, they're hiding it from the enemy. To try to hide a path through the woods must mean that your boat is not that big. I mean, if I'm sitting there taking a 24, 28-foot boat through the woods, I don't care how careful I am, sitting there and try to move something, around, it will be visible. So I use that piece of information in part for the design. And the soldiers were not Bateaux men. Most of the Yankees were farm laborers. The ones that came from here, and it's the only ones I know for sure, the ones that came from here were unmarried and childless. A lot of them got married within a couple of years, but they were unmarried and childless, and I'll tell you later why that's important. The guys who came from here, I'll get to that later too, sorry. God damn, that phone talking to me. It just, this is the way we like to think getting a bateau up a river is, okay? Whoops, I guess I didn't have the picture I wanted. This is Fort Western, 20 miles up the river. By now, some of these boats have already been damaged pretty well, They have to do their first big portage, besides the one right there at Fort Western, to get to Fort Halifax. Both of these forts were French and Indian War forts, and they were in pretty bad shape by this time. They weren't really necessary, but they existed enough that they could have some of the men sleep there and store gear there. And these are what the Maine Maritime Museum calls idling power units. When they carried a bateau, 4 men carried it. They didn't use the oxen. The oxen were used for supplies. Now, it's probably easier for 4 men to portage a big 20-foot bateau than for 4 men to carry a 32-inch long, 300-pound barrel of salt pork. And so they use the oxen for moving supplies. These are antique cows. I say they're antiques because there's only 600 of them left. And what it was is at the bicentennial, 1975, people realized there were a lot of breeds that were going extinct. And this was one of them. And so they're now, people have been raising them, and they're now 600, and they're called American Milking Devons. And they're a great medium-sized cow that does the 3 things, not all at once, or the same cow, but does the 3 things you need. It's a milk cow, it's a beef cow, or it's an oxen. And so this would have been the oxen they had at the time of the American Revolution. And this is Skowhegan Falls. Now, how they have a photograph of Skowhegan just amazes me. I don't know when the dam went in, but this is their next set of rapids they have to get around. And actually, the portage around the falls wasn't the worst thing they'd ever done. This is an artist's drawing of portaging, and artists, we do an absolutely horrible job of showing how our ancestors carried heavy objects. The way you see in a Lewis and Clark reenactment, the guys would be dead on the first day of carrying a log canoe. They knew how to move heavy things. They had 50,000 years of teaching them how to move heavy things. They knew how to do it, and this is not it. This is how you do it. Now, one thing that we had on this trip that they didn't have is there were dams. There weren't dams then, Also meant there was quite a bit of flat water, okay? But what do you have at a dam that you didn't have 250 years ago? Drunken fishermen. And so you show up with your boat, and all the drunken fishermen think, well, that would be fun. And they help carry your boat around at Waterville. Now, this is a high school class that just happened to be at Skowhegan, and they teach some sort of running rapids or something class, but that's how we moved that one. Another one is one of the guys on our trip called up college students in northern Vermont that he knew would be passing by and got them to stop by at midnight and move the boat for them. And this is the Great Carry, and it's 13 miles. There would have been the Dead River just wandering all around here before they created Flagstaff Lake. But this 13-mile carry prevented trying to go around this impossible to go, even birch bark canoe, you name it, impossible loop to go. And it's a 10,000-year-old portage. And this is us portaging on the Great Carry. We had dirt roads and rollers. The soldiers took about 5 days to carry their boats. We took 5 days to carry our boats, and we had dirt roads. And old people just wander out of the woods and help you. The youngest guy who wandered out of the woods to help us is 68. I wish I had a picture of it. I have a picture somewhere of this 82-year-old woman, little woman, with 2 rollers under her arms, who was helping us one day on moving the boat. And you will also notice we're not moving any cargo. And you may think these are idling power units. They're now protein. While they got to this point, they ate the last of their oxen. They had already lost quite a bit of food by here. This is what sleeping at night is supposed to look like. This is what sleeping at night is, and you can't tell, but it's raining. I don't know how we got that fire going.
Are you saying that they carried the oxen along?
I mean, they would make them, poor oxen, they'd have to walk until they got killed. They killed them. Yeah. Yeah. I'm in all wool except for my khaki pants. The water jug froze the night before. We've already capsized about 5 times that day, and I'm in my wool clothes and loving every minute of it. I would do that 1,000,000 times over going outside here like yesterday. Forget it. Here we go. The last quarter, 300 men turned back, and we like to criticize them for that. They were criticized at that time period also, but you figure these 300 men have followed these other 900 or 800. They've seen all the boats that have been destroyed. They've seen all the food that had been lost. It's believed that these guys had heavier boats and more cargo because they were coming in the end. And why would we ever assume that these guys had any better luck at running these rapids and not having their bateaux capsize and all the rest? Well, these last 300 men got up with these guys. One of the group of these guys hadn't had food for 6 days. And it's like, you guys are crazy. We're leaving. Now, one of these 3 groups are the Woolwich Quitters. but they really weren't. Even though they were from the lower Kennebec, they went back to the siege of Boston. They had been at the siege of Boston, they went back to the siege of Boston. One of these guys from Woolwich had joined as a substitute. A private had paid him, a private got sick and paid him to take his place. This substitute, by the end of the war, was a captain. By the War of 1812, he was a lieutenant colonel. There's another guy in this group, starts as a private, and by the end of the war, he's a captain. Quite a number of these people would start as privates and be sergeants and lieutenants by the end of the war. These guys weren't quitting the revolution. You know, they were saying this isn't a good idea to continue on. And this is more likely portaging. That's the Dead River that's above Flagstaff Lake, but we're now trying to get up where there's no water to speak of, and you will notice we don't have any cargo in the boat. There's not any reason to have the boat with no cargo. I mean, if you didn't have cargo, you walked, you know, but just showing how hard it was that these guys had it. And as you'll see, there is even less water. And again, there is no cargo in that boat. And we're trying to get up the chain of ponds. Around this time, they're told to abandon their boats. You know, there are only probably 50 of them left. They were told to abandon their boats and to every man for himself. They were eating their shoes. Anything they had that was leather, they would try eating. Obviously, if they're eating the shoes, they're barefoot. Some of these guys are practically naked, and they've been told that to just go from the top of the chain of ponds in Maine over 4 or 6 miles into the Chaudière. You just, don't sit there and try to stay as a unit. Just make the best you can. They had had a hurricane come through and the water raised 8 feet. We had a heavy rain, and so this isn't really accurate because we're now going downriver. We had had a heavy rain, and that's what happened after a day of heavy rain. That's me just standing in the water. It's end of October, and I just have about a foot of rope around my waist, and I'm waiting for the guys to come back and help me. Now you may wonder, who's filming this, and why isn't he helping? But we probably swamped 15 times in 3 days, going down this 20 miles or so. Darn. There should be a picture, there should be a video of me repairing the Bateaux after the 15th time we swamped. And in the video, I'm asking one of the crew members what kind of underwear he has. And he says, I'm not giving you my underwear. And I say, come on, it's for the good of the whatever. And Harding, who was our guru, he had 100% cotton underwear, which I didn't want to take because I don't want to have him meet the Queen with no underwear. But we went and ripped it up and caulked it into the different cracks in the boat to deal with that. Oh, damn. Can you tell that I'm missing 2 slides here? No? Darn. The next slide, we're going downriver, and the guy filming is behind me, and I'm in the middle. And as I'm sitting here pumping the water out, buckets of water is coming into the boat. And the guy guiding the boat says, we're going to eddy out, which means we're going to get off the river, which turned out to be good because around the corner was a waterfall that we had thought was a number of miles further along. I'm sorry that isn't there. They get to Quebec City, starving, naked, no shoes. It's not a secret anymore. The British know they're coming. The British have destroyed all the small boats on this side, our side of the river. But they went across to the fields of Abraham and sat there for 6 weeks, staring at this. It doesn't belong here, it belongs in Europe. I mean, it's this huge stone fortress. And they sat there and they stared at it for 6 weeks, you know. And eventually they got some food, and eventually they got some clothing. A lot of the clothing they got were British soldiers' uniforms. And so they put a little piece of paper in their hat saying liberty or death. But a lot of them are running around in red coats. And they stare at this for 6 weeks. Well, and all the while, we may shoot a 6-pound ball into the city, and the British will reply with a 32-pound ball coming out at us. These Yankees, their enlistment runs out on the end of the year. And that was the problem with the Army at that point, is everybody's enlistments were running out. Nobody fights in the winter. You don't fight in the winter because you have a musket, you have a hammer with a little pan, and in that pan you put gunpowder, which will touch off the gunpowder in the barrel and shoot your bullets. If it's wet snow, 1 in 10 of these muskets fired when they finally did attack the city. Okay, they sat there and they planned to attack the city. They kept having a constant flow of deserters going both directions. And so a deserter on our side had told the British that we were coming the next day or whatever. And fortunately, we found out that they had learned, and so we moved a couple of days later, but we moved it to the 31st of December. And they had to keep changing their plans. And a couple hundred soldiers that had come with Montgomery from Lake Champlain, Montreal, what have you, they came down this route here. It was a very narrow path, in some places where only one man could walk. It was very narrow to begin with, and then all these chunks of ice were always being forced up into the path, and so it was a 1 or 2 person path. Arnold was, come on. Arnold was coming from this side over here into the lower town. And again, it was only a couple of streets at that time period. There's a few more been built out into the water, but there were only a couple of streets. And there were 2 groups of soldiers that were attacking the city up and beyond it. That was the original place a day or 2 earlier that we planned on attacking, because this deserter had told the British, the Americans, Arnold and Montgomery. Montgomery was the general, Arnold was a colonel. They attacked from this lower way. there were some officers, we criticized the three companies that turned back. I was showing you about the guy Enos, General Enos, or whatever Enos, and three of the last companies, the quitters. These guys turned back. There were three officers of the other 9 companies who refused to fight. Their men were willing to fight, but the 3 officers refused to fight. And they just, again, bad luck. The Montgomery, coming along this narrow path, the British had not expected to be attacked at that point, and did not have many soldiers. They had a lot of, people who weren't professional soldiers there. And they came along this narrow path. It's dark, it's snowing to beat the band, and they get up to this barricade, and General Montgomery starts tearing it apart with other people. And this, this is a great story. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But this one drunken British sailor, supposedly touched off the cannon. That was the only bit of firing at these Americans. And it touched off the cannon, and it killed Montgomery, and it killed his number 1 man, and it killed his number 2 man, and it killed a few more people right in the front. And you also got to figure, if you're marching single file or two abreast, you're not going to have a clue as to what just happened right there. And the guy who is now the head officer for this group of soldiers went back, and that was it for Montgomery's men. Arnold's men came along on the bottom, and Arnold, right at the beginning, got shot in the leg, and bad enough that he had to be taken off the field. And also meaning his soldiers would all go past him, seeing that he was not able to fight, But the soldiers went on, and they attacked this one barricade and captured so many soldiers. It was a problem for them. It's like, what are they going to do with all these soldiers we've captured? They go and they get to the next barricade, and they're sort of planning about how to attack it. The problem for them is by now the guy in charge of the army here knew that Montgomery had failed, and he knew that these 2 false attacks were not real. So he knew the only real threat was Arnold's men. And he was able to send 60 or so soldiers down behind Arnold's men. And so Arnold's men are now, and they're in a little village, and there was house-to-house fighting in this little village. But eventually they had, probably when they ran out of gunpowder, or their guns just would not fire, they had to surrender. This is what I was telling you about. Arnold's coming this way, Montgomery's coming this way, and there were just a couple of false attacks along there. And they brought ladders with them, because they knew they were going to have to climb barricades. I do have one pension application from around 1830 by one of these men who says he was going up the ladder, and the ladder was blown away by chain shot. Chain shot is something used in the Navy. It really is, and it's used to take out the ropes or whatever that's holding the mast up or something. But it's also, I guess, pretty good for anti-personnel. And took out the ladder. And eventually, the Americans were forced to surrender. I think about 100 Americans were killed. I think over 300 were captured. And one of the things I want to point out is these guys had said they're done. These guys had said, come January 1st, I'm leaving. But on December 31st, after staring at this city for 6 weeks, they're like, yeah, let's do it. I said I'd be a part of this, you know. And I like to say, especially about the miserable conditions coming up to Kennebec, these guys weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people who did what a superhero has to do. I mean, these were just farmers and oh God, one of the officers was a hairdresser. You know, blacksmiths, just ordinary people, you know. They 300 or so were captured. I guess at this point, the general in charge of the Canadians, the British, treated them very well. And in fact, some of the people who were in prison decades later named their sons after the guy who had held them prisoner. I guess he was very kind to them. But they did keep trying to escape. They did assume that the Americans who weren't captured would attempt to take the city again. You know, they had a plan to, you know, for 60 of them to take the city from the inside, and unfortunately, one of these people who knew about it was a spy for the British, you know. But they weren't giving up. And all the while, slowly, American troops are coming up Lake Champlain and up the St. Lawrence to join this. And so slowly, they're getting more and more troops to take the city. And they know, and the British know, it's a race. It's a race between enough Americans showing up before the ice goes out. Because when the ice goes out, 10,000 British soldiers sail in. And the British won that race. I think when they came, there might have been 3,000 Americans, with 1,000 of them had smallpox. And another bit of bad luck is I seem like I'm picking on officers. I don't know. All the officers in that Northern Army, the guy in charge of the Northern Army said they were all worthless. So the only officer he had that was any damn good was Benedict Arnold, okay? But Benedict Arnold's been badly wounded, you know, and so for the first couple of months, you know, he kept saying, look, you gotta send somebody here. You know, well, finally, 2 or 3 days before the British show up, a good American general shows up, looks at what's going on and says, we have to evacuate. Well, he didn't realize the British were going to land and immediately attack. Now, if any of you get seasick, you'll understand why that general didn't think they would immediately attack, because I know that if I just got off the boat, I was not going to be in any position to attack. But they attacked, and people my age don't like it when I say this, but Ho Chi Minh would have said it was a success. We tend to just look at the one little thing with Benedict Arnold, and we don't even want to acknowledge it exists. But the Americans sat there through the summer, and they fought the British and lost, and fought the British and lost, and fought the British and lost as the British drove them out of Canada. And by October, the Americans were in Lake Champlain. And Benedict Arnold went and cobbled together a navy. And the British were also building a much nicer navy on Lake Champlain. And around October 10th or so, the British Navy came down to attack the Americans, and Benedict Arnold had hid behind an island. And the British Navy comes down, and they all of a sudden, once they've gone too far, and what I mean by too far is if you're a sailing vessel, you don't want to be forced to go upwind. So they had been blown downwind from Arnold, and they attacked, and they won, but I mean it took all day, and the Americans ended up taking their boats to the Vermont side and burning them and what have you. But it kept the British from continuing down to Ticonderoga, which is at the end of the lake. And the British said, hey, it's October. You don't fight in the winter. We'll go back to Canada where we know we've got barracks and everything else. And so they went back to Canada and they took their time. And all the while, the Americans down around Ticonderoga and Saratoga were getting ready for the next year. And by now, Arnold was like I said, that one general said Arnold was his only good guy. By now, Arnold has even pissed this guy off. And the British are coming, and they're coming to Saratoga, and the general tells Arnold he's not to be involved. He's confined to his tent. And they go on, I mean, I'm really shortening this up. They had a 2-day battle, and I don't think it was day 1, day 2, I think it was separate. They had this battle, and at some point, Arnold realized that this group of soldiers needed to be rallied. And he gets on a horse and he rides over, right in front of the British, and he rallies the troops, and they defeat the British. And I have to look this up, but I've been told this is the first time a British army has surrendered. The Americans took over 6,000 British soldiers at Saratoga, and thereby shutting off this route of cutting the upper colonies from the lower colonies. You can't talk about Saratoga without talking about Arnold. But nobody wants to talk about Arnold. Now, at Quebec, right at the beginning, he was badly shot in his leg. At Saratoga, again, he's badly shot in his leg. And so the statue is of a boot. That's Arnold, there's no Arnold on that, carved onto that stone, nothing. That boot is representing Benedict Arnold. There's a story, I have no idea if it's true or not, of once Benedict Arnold turned sides, he asked an American what would happen if the Americans caught him. And the guy said, well, we'll bury your leg with full military honors, but we'll hang the rest of you. And it only just hit me a little while ago that, I grew up my whole life always saying, oh, don't be a Benedict Arnold. I've always heard this, right? But it only just finally hit me that he was their best general, or one of their best generals. George Washington loved him. And so for George Washington to lose him, that wasn't like losing some worthless general who cares if he changes sides or not. I mean, that was a huge deal, to lose Benedict Arnold. That's about it. I know I've probably run way too long. The Arnold Expedition, we are going to build, this house still exists, it's down the road, it's one of the soldiers. The Arnold Expedition is building a bunch of bateaux. We're going to build one right here. Anybody who wants to volunteer to build is welcome to join. We're just finishing one at the Woolwich Historical Society. The kids at the Kittery High School finished one a little while ago. We're gonna build one with the kids at the Bristol School in September. We are building one at the Pittsburgh, at the Reuben Colburn House barn, and Fort Halifax, the Friends of Fort Halifax have finished one up. But we're doing this, and we're also working on preserving the trail. And that orange marker, I mean, there's this 13-mile carry. That orange marker preserves the trail. And see, anybody can be allowed to work on a boat, you know. And like I say, keep an eye on what's happening here. If you wanna volunteer here. Oh, I know I can tell because it's the right temperature, and I didn't go on too long, and so everybody's just sharp. And I have two questions. My first question is, I need to do a little bit of math, and I'll be glad to write this down for you. You have 4 groups of people. There's 3 companies in each group. One of them actually has 4. If you want to make it easier, just say there's 3 companies and 4 groups. What are the odds that just by the random luck of the draw, what are the odds that the last 3 are all going to be the ones picked, are all going to be the ones who quit? You know, it's obvious to me that it wasn't just luck of the draw that these last 3 companies left. They obviously, what they had experienced proved to them that they should. And one other thing is, you see this beautiful piece of wood? I need dozens of them. Dozens of them. We're not building 220 Bateaux, so I don't need 2,000 of them. But I'm looking for just maple, any hardwood. What?
Hard to find something like that. I mean, the bend of it, does it have to be a particular angle?
Well, actually, I just realized they don't. What it has is you need to have, there'll be 4 sets of frames. So you need 8 of them that all have the same angle. You know, it could be different, but as long as you get 8 ones with the same angle. And they can be quite delicate. And you don't have to bring one with you to help build a Bateaux, but you'll definitely get brownie points if you bring one with you. Sorry,
I have one question. So you had 3 things at the beginning that you wanted to
Oh, what were they?
So the first one was the Woolwich abandoned
Quitters.
The second one was the Bateaux were poorly made, and that was BS. And number 3 was that women were involved in this, and we didn't
Yes.
do that. So can you-
There are 2 women in the journals, okay? And so when we write an article, a history, we say there were 2 women on the trip. And I'm saying that you only write about somebody when there's an unusual event. It doesn't have to be big, but there's an unusual event. These guys were not right. I don't even know the names of the other 5 guys in their mess, you know. Both of these events happen, they happen by the time they've gotten to the Canadian border, all right? So there have been women on the trip. Let's start with just say Newburyport, not even say Boston. There have been women on the trip from Newburyport. And it was odd you would probably write about it, okay? And of these two women, one of them is actually three women. And the reason I say it's three women is you have the exact same story, but the date and what happened to the woman don't agree. I mean, the date is a couple of days off, but one woman rejoined her squad 20 hours later. The other woman, it was 3 weeks before she rejoined. So these are obviously two, I mean, it's about a woman sitting there with her husband while he dies of starvation, you know. There were quite a number of women who followed the army, and I don't mean the women who were wives. And if you think about it, you're over in England, you're on the Liverpool docks, and you go and you enlist 200 of these bums from the Liverpool docks, and you're going to send them across the ocean for 12 years. You don't want their wives and kids staying there. You now have orphans and widows, you know. And so wives and children were allowed and were actually supplied with the army. There were regulations, you know, Arnold or Washington at some point was like, Jesus, so many of them. Can't we have a limit on only 1 in 4 soldiers can have a woman with them? They were not allowed to cook, but they could do everything else. And for money. I mean, they could sew, they could wash, what have you. But for a reason I don't know, except for I'm guessing they want the soldiers to remain really self-sufficient, they were not allowed to cook. But and the 3 women that we talk about all came from Pennsylvania. And so these women, you know, came all the way to Boston, not knowing what would happen. And in Boston, they're heading to Quebec. And while I'm trying to look up the people's histories of the Kennebec men, they basically were all single and childless, you know, and so they would not have had women coming with